During the coldest years of the Little Ice Age, when winter didn't last 3 or 4 months, but 8 straight months, and the temperature dropped to -30 and just stayed there like a sentence being carried out, running out of firewood wasn't a small inconvenience. It was a death sentence for an entire family. There were no supermarkets, no gas stations, nowhere to grab a little extra wood for tonight.
Stay here, not with
The forests were locked down under the Lord's orders, and the wardens patrolling them were ready to fine you, beat you, or jail you for picking up even a fallen branch. And when you heard the wind slicing through the cracks of an earth-walled house, when your children's breath turned into white smoke inside your own room, when a hearth going out for just 1 hour plunged the entire home into freezing darkness, you finally understood why medieval people called winter the silent killer. The terrifying part was that they had no backup plan. Firewood was the backbone of society, yet it was the thing they touched the most, and were forbidden to touch at all. Poor families could only stare at the distant woods, the place holding the one thing that could save them from freezing to death. Yet they weren't allowed to take a single step toward it. And in that desperate situation, they were forced to invent fuels so strange that even today, just hearing about them makes people shudder. And if you enjoy real survival stories full of these brutal paradoxes, leave a small comment below. It lets me know you're still here, and it helps these forgotten stories live one more time. In the medieval world, wood wasn't just a material. It was the lifeblood of an entire civilization, a kind of social oxygen that, once taken away, caused everything to collapse instantly. People slept inside wooden houses, walked on wooden floors, ate with wooden spoons, plowed their fields with wooden handles, and even the roof above them, trembling in the cold wind, cracked with a dry, splintering sound that made anyone's heart clench. When winter tightened its grip, every fiber of a house stretched and shrank, producing noises like human bones fracturing beneath ice. The wooden table grew so cold you didn't dare rest your hand on it. The wooden shovel stiffened in the frost, and even the door froze so hard you had to yank it open with force. Wood existed in every breath of daily life, but precisely because of that, its scarcity spread fear faster than any snowstorm. When forests were cleared for farmland and the remaining woods were locked down by the Lord, people didn't just lose fuel, they lost the foundation of their existence. A small crack in a wall plank could be the signal that death was drawing near. And standing before a house trembling in the icy wind, they understood that if they didn't find something to replace wood, they wouldn't survive until spring. In any medieval survival story, the darkest part isn't the cold. It's the forest law, a system so ruthless that the moment you hear it, you understand winter wasn't the only enemy the poor had to face. As ancient forests shrank because of expanding farmland, the nobility immediately tightened ownership and turned the woods into their private treasure vault. Not a treasure of gold, but a treasure of firewood. The one thing that could keep a human being alive on a -30-degree night. In theory, they claimed it was to protect the game. But in reality, they locked away the lifeline of millions. A peasant could literally see dry branches right in front of him, hear them clacking together in the wind as if calling his name. Yet he couldn't touch them because he didn't own the right of Estover. And then came the twist that stuns modern people. Stealing a single dry branch wouldn't get you hanged. But the fines could easily push an entire family into starving and freezing to death. A slow execution the authorities didn't even have to carry out themselves. In many regions, forest wardens equipped with clubs, bows, and hunting dogs patrolled day and night to catch people who only wanted a few pieces of wood to start a fire. The tragedy was brutal. The thing right in front of them was the thing forbidden most. Medieval people understood one cruel truth. The one who controlled the forest controlled life itself in winter. And if you ever thought poverty back then just meant lack of money, winter would show you. It also meant being forbidden to touch the one thing that could save your family. If you have any thoughts or experiences about this kind of resource injustice, feel free to share them in the comments. Your story might illuminate another hidden corner of this history. In the survival history of the medieval world, there's a secret that makes anyone who reads it stop cold. They had a perfect solution in their hands to end the fuel crisis, yet they weren't allowed to use it. That solution was called coppicing, a forest regeneration technique where, by cutting a tree close to the base, the stump would grow back into multiple new shoots, faster and thicker than any sapling. A small woodland, if properly coppiced, could keep an entire village warm for generations without clearing a single additional patch of land. When you walk into a coppiced forest, the sight is strange. Stumps swollen like giant tables, bursting with tall young shoots towering over your head. It looks like the forest is replicating itself. But this is where the real climax appears. The peasants understood this technique perfectly, knew it could save their families through winter, yet they still had to stand a full meter away, only daring to look at the lush green shoots without touching them. The forest grew fast, grew beautifully, grew exactly as they needed, but every piece of it belonged to the Lord. Coppicing a stump without permission could be viewed as damaging property, and the consequences were enough to bring an entire village to ruin. The bitterness lies here. Medieval society did not lack knowledge, did not lack technology, did not lack sustainable solutions. They only lacked the right to use them to survive. Coppicing became the symbol of a cruel truth. Sometimes, the thing that could save your life isn't something you don't know, but something you know all too well and are forbidden to touch. Peat, often called brown gold, wasn't a luxurious fuel, but in regions without forests, it was the only thing standing between life and death. When spring thawed the ground, the whole village moved out to the bogs, where the earth felt like a giant sponge and every step made a wet, sinking sound. Men used long, narrow spades to cut heavy, water-soaked blocks of peat, each one dripping as if bleeding from the soil. Women and children lined them up across the drying fields, where wind and sun would decide whether they would stay warm or freeze to death when winter returned. The entire landscape carried the smell of damp earth mixed with a faint burnt tang, the signature scent of villages that lived without trees. But the real power of peat wasn't in its flame. It was in its smoldering ember. It rarely flared up, never crackled, but glowed quietly through the night, keeping the house from turning into a chamber of ice. The price was a room filled with thick, stinging smoke that burned the throat and brought tears to the eyes. But to medieval people, that was the smell of survival, not discomfort. Many records note that the size of the peat stack outside one's home was essentially a declaration of life. Whoever had the tallest pile was the one the village knew would make it through the winter. That humble brown earth, in the coldest years, was sometimes more precious than real gold. In the regions where forests had vanished generations ago, medieval people had to rely on plants that modern eyes would dismiss as weeds, gorse, heather, and straw. But to them, these weren't weeds. They were the fuel of destiny. Winter fields of gorse looked like a sea of yellowed thorns, so sharp that a light touch could split the skin. Yet peasants still had to walk into them, bending down to pull out each small branch, their hands numb not only from the cold, but from the thorns punching through rough gloves. Heather grew in dark purple clusters, beautiful like something out of legend. but once dry, it twisted tight and hardened like wire. To gather even one bundle, people had to yank with both hands until their wrists throbbed. And even then, there was no guarantee of warmth. Flames from heather or straw burned fiercely, but only for 3 minutes, flaring bright, then dying as if they had never existed. That's why winter nights in houses without wood carried a strange, haunting quality. In the pitch-black room, a child sat trembling by the hearth, cupping their hands to shield a tiny flame from the wind, waiting for the exact moment it began to fade so they could push in another handful of gorse. Every flicker, every small burst of fire felt fragile and sacred, as if holding on to the last bit of warmth left in the world. Those brief flames were never enough to truly heat a home, but they were enough to keep a family alive for a few more hours. If you've ever witnessed or felt the strange beauty of small, fragile things that keep people alive, share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes it's those delicate details that make history feel most alive. Of all the desperate fuels medieval people were forced to use, dung was the one that made both modern readers and medieval folk themselves shudder. Yet it also created one of the deepest survival tragedies of the age. Every morning, women and children walked out to the livestock pens, baskets in hand, the warm breath of the animals mixing with the skin-cutting cold. They bent down to gather clumps of still, soft dung, mixed them with bits of straw, and shaped them into round cakes that they pressed onto the outer walls to dry in the wind. The walls of a poor home became a strange kind of mural, dozens of brown cakes lined up in rows under the sun, looking both crude and haunting. Once dry, those small dung cakes burned for a long time, giving off a slow, steady heat just strong enough to keep the cold from sinking into the bones. And this is where the real climax appears. Dung wasn't just fuel. It was also the only fertilizer that could keep next year's harvest alive enough to feed the family. Every dung cake burned tonight was a piece of next year's food supply going up in smoke. Medieval families had to choose between two kinds of death: freezing to death this winter, or starving to death in the summer to come. That choice turned every single dung cake into a painful symbol of survival's cruel paradox. If that moment of choice feels brutal but deeply human, share your thoughts. Sometimes these contradictions are what help us understand history more profoundly. In the medieval world, charcoal wasn't just fuel. It was the art of fire and patience, a refined heat that only those willing to risk their health could create. When a charcoal burn began, the forest suddenly turned into a secret workshop. Logs were stacked into a cone, covered with soil and damp moss, leaving only a few small vents for smoke to escape. And then the most dangerous task began: keeping the fire alive without letting it flare. The colliers, the charcoal makers, stood watch for 3 days and 3 nights, barely sleeping, their eyes bloodshot from smoke, their clothes so saturated with the scent of burning wood that anyone in the village could identify them from afar. They listened to every tiny sound. A single sharp crack could mean the mound was about to erupt into flames, destroying not only the entire batch, but their winter livelihood. The acrid charcoal smoke mixed with thick mist created an atmosphere both mysterious and threatening, as if they were tending a sleeping creature, one that, if awakened the wrong way, would swallow the entire forest. But when they succeeded, they produced a fuel twice as powerful as wood, strong enough to forge iron, burn lime, and keep wealthier families warm. And if you ever thought heat came easily, Try imagining standing in that choking haze for 3 straight nights. Then share your thoughts in the comments. When the last forests were locked down and peat, heather, and dung were no longer enough to save the cities swelling larger every year, medieval people were forced to turn their eyes to something they once considered the devil's stone: coal. Sea coal washed up on the English coast looked like lifeless black lumps, but once ignited, it produced a heat no poor fuel could match. And that heat sparked one of the first political flexes in Europe's energy history. As London expanded like a fire-hungry beast, the wealthy began flaunting their prosperity through smoke. The more coal they burned, the thicker and yellower the smoke became, an invisible signal that this household could afford the strongest and filthiest fuel. The city sank into a gray haze so dense that on some days the sun was nothing more than a faint blot. The poor coughed themselves breathless, the rich kept burning. Craftsmen switched to sea coal for efficiency, while nobles used the very thing they claimed to despise to heat their manors in winter. It reached the point that in 1272, King Edward V issued a ban on burning sea coal because of the horrific pollution, yet no one obeyed. The law said stop, but the coal kept burning. A royal order meant less than the cold. It was the moment that revealed where real power lived, not in the palace, but in the glowing black lumps beneath every rooftop. And if you have any thoughts about this first great energy war in human history, drop a comment. Sometimes a single sentence can illuminate an entire era. If there is a moment that forces us to stop and re-examine this entire story, it's when you stand before a medieval village on a winter night and see different columns of smoke rising into the sky. The smoke from wealthy homes is thin, pale, clean, a sign of expensive charcoal or coal. But the smoke from poor homes is thick, yellow, and heavy with the smell of peat, dung, and burning brush, rolling upward in dense ribbons as if the entire house were burning itself just to stay alive through the night. And that's the real hook. The warm smell of a poor family in winter wasn't the smell of firewood. It was the smell of injustice. The greatest lesson in the story of medieval fuel isn't about what they burned, but about who was allowed to burn what. Medieval people didn't lack the knowledge to manage forests sustainably, didn't lack the techniques to regenerate wood endlessly, didn't lack the clever solutions that even modern science still admires. The only thing they lacked was access, the right to use the forest, the right to stay warm, the right to live without being punished for picking up a fallen branch. It was the control of resources by a small elite that forced millions to burn toxic peat, scrape together handfuls of dung, or stand guard over a weak flame all night just to keep their homes warm for a few more hours. And when you look back, you'll see a truth as cold as winter itself. History wasn't written only in blood and steel, but also in smoke. The thick, stinging smoke rising from poor roofs, carrying the silent sighs of people who only wanted to survive one more season. If you have any thoughts about this lesson, leave a comment below. And if you want to keep exploring history told with honesty and emotion like this, don't forget to subscribe so we don't miss any of the hidden corners of the past.